So according to Lucas, all of Star Wars was planned out. The original trilogy as well as the prequels. That is a lie. The prequels were planned out. However, I will prove that despite Lucasfilm's original plans following through for the sequel trilogy, it is a moot point since the original trilogy didn't have a plan, and that the great plot twists of the original trilogy were made to satisfy solving narrative problems. J.J. Abrams allegedly had the plan for the sequel trilogy, as even stated by the prosecution. I say allegedly because according to Daisy Ridley, in an interview on the Jimmy Kimmel show, there was a plan for her parentage in the sequel trilogy. Abrams also told Adam Driver for his plans for Kylo Ren story arc, as Driver said in an interview with Ian's Life. J.J. Abrams told me when I met him for the first time that I should imagine a journey of the character completely opposite of Darth Vader. So albeit a loose plan, the notion was there that so that the idea of them having no plan was false. However, it seemed Rian Johnson jettisoned these outlines to make a powerful yet divisive film in the franchise, The Last Jedi. It was a film that closed all the mystery boxes Abrams set up that built fan excitement. However, let's say having a loose plan is as bad as having a no plan. Then the Infinity Saga should be bad. Because in an interview with IGN, Joss Whedon stated that there was no plan for what to do with Thanos after his cameo. So maybe having no plan, maybe the fact that the Infinity Saga was so good, maybe that's a fluke. Or maybe not. Despite Lucas's claims that he had the original trilogy planned out, before the release of Star Wars back in '77, Lucas commissioned writer Alan Dean Foster to write a sequel novel in case Star Wars was a flop called Splinter of the Mind's Eye. In a link, I said in a link for the defense, a link to the Wikipedia page of Splinter of a Mind's Eye. And this is so you can see that behind the scenes information, such as the direction of the book being abandoned when Star Wars became a hit. But more so, it features the plot that depicts none of the characters that would be introduced in Empire, such as Lando, Yoda, or Boba Fett. So if Lucas really planned out the original trilogy like he said, there would be at least seeds of these characters within the book. The idea of Vader being Luke's father wasn't introduced until later. One of the biggest things that were planned in the twist, according to Lucas, was Vader being Luke's father, something that Lucas has gone on record saying that he planned since the original Star Wars. According to his ex-wife, who is Marcia Lucas, as we mentioned earlier, who had saved Star Wars in the editing bay and helped develop certain story ideas that became bedrocks of Star Wars. In the docu-series Icon Unearthed, as stated in the Inverse article, the Inverse article interviewing the director Brian Volk Weiss, George Lucas was struggling to come up with some kind of big twist for Empire's third act. While stuck, Marcia and Lucas invited screenwriters Willard Huck and Gloria Katz over for dinner. The couple had worked with Lucas before, including an uncredited rewrite of A New Hope. When Lucas described his struggles with the Empire story, Huck joked, "You can always make Darth Vader Luke's father." And this is also evidenced in the original screenwriter Lee Brackett, who wrote the first draft of Empire Strikes Back. There was no mention of Vader being Luke's father. In fact, if I can share another screen, in an article from Screen Rant, there is an excerpt from Brackett's original script where it says here, where it had Anakin mentioning that his twin sister, training Luke, with mentioning to Luke that he had a twin sister, not Leia, and Anakin explaining that he told Obi-Wan not to reveal his sibling for fear that Vader would use her as a hostage. And here's the depiction as well. Anakin, you've grown up well, Luke. I'm proud of you. Did your uncle ever speak to you about your sister? Luke, my sister? I have a sister? But why didn't Uncle Owen? Anakin, it was my request. When I saw the Empire closing in, I sent you both away for your own safety, far apart from each other. Luke, where is she? What's her name? Anakin, if I were to tell you, Darth Vader would get that information from your mind and use her as a hostage. Not yet, Luke. When it's time, Luke, you will take from me the oath of a Jedi Knight. And for my, oops, share my screen. And for my last bit of evidence is that Leia being Luke's sister was added later. Originally, Luke's sister was to be identified later, but Lucas changed his mind. In an anecdote, in the annotated notes of the script, Luke Skywalker made Luke and Leia's siblings out of a creative purpose, as stated in the annotated screenplays. In the end, I had a knowledge in the fight between Luke and his father of why Luke makes the final turn to the bad side of the Force and tries to kill his father. Director Richard Marquand was trying to block out the fight between Luke and Vader, and we got down to the point underneath the throne room there, and he said, you know, the script sort of says that Vader says something that upsets Luke, or something vague like that. And we didn't have the actual moment that we needed where you got the sense that Luke is hiding. He's not going to fight him. He'd rather die first, and then something turns him and makes him fight. And in the process of evolving the script and evolving the importance of Leia as a sister, it'd be sitting right there in front of my face, and became obvious that turning her to the dark side would be the thing that sends Luke off. So my point being, oh, whoops, let me go back to this page. So does Lucas not having the original trilogy plan out change the quality of these films? I'd say no. Does it make Luke a liar? Does it make Lucas a liar? That's not what this argument is about. However, it is for the best that the original trilogy wasn't planned out. Look at the divisive prequels as evidence of that. To quote the commenter Joseph Reinman from Chiara, you need to understand that the original trilogy wasn't envisioned to be a trilogy. They made one movie they were sure was going to flop, then kept their fingers crossed that they'd get another one. When the movie turned out to be a hit, they got to do Empire and planned to keep going for at least 3 to 5 more films, depending on how things turned out. Maybe what was part of the success of the original trilogy was that there were no guarantees that there would be another one. So they tried to tell the best story they could. Regardless, the idea of the sequel trilogy is somehow lacking because they didn't have an overreaching plan is moot. The best trilogy didn't need one.
Hey, Your Honor, I need to object on the relevance here. Willie, all due respect, can you offer the relevance of this testimony, please, sir?
I would also like to object to the admission of anything from Lee Brackett's Star Wars script, because Anakin was not named in that script.
Mr. Willie, your response? The jury is listening.
Sure, absolutely. So the point I'm making is that the fact that the original trilogy, that the sequel trilogy didn't have a plan it's moot point because the original trilogy didn't have one. Now, the fact of the sequel trilogy being good or bad, that's a matter up to the audience for taste. Because as you can see, both trilogies, they have their fans.
If I may, this goes to the idea of mismanagement and negligence.
Exactly.
Because if the Star Wars original trilogy could go off and be the creative and financial success that it was without a plan, basically making stuff up as we go, then we can't call that very same style of filmmaking with what Disney did with the sequel trilogy negligence or mismanagement. That's the point.
Well, you have. I would argue that, as the creator of a product, so as George Lucas is the creator of Star Wars, and as he's creating the original trilogy, which we got to remember was we don't have a franchise yet until he starts telling the story. So once he creates his trilogy, no matter how many times he's changed it or whether it's planned out or not, once the creator has turned over the product to other creatives, it's paramount that those creatives, as we've seen in IPs like Star Trek, it's critical that the canon or that the story that is followed, the respect of what's happened before is followed. And would it still be Star Wars if somebody just decided to say, well, I'm going to do what George did and I'm going to make it whatever I want it to be?
Well, you get from reading the synopsis of the plot from Splinter of the Mind's Eye that he did allow people to go their own way for telling the story, and he actually just rejected the entire book.
So are you basically then saying that as the creator, he has the right to say what is canon and not canon at his will at that point, whether something has come out into the public eye? That's his prerogative as the creator, and I think that's what my colleague was arguing in his point. But I don't know if we were ready for a rebuttal on their argument yet, so I just was, I have no questions at this point.
Let's move on to Father Dave and comments you'll say before we take a brief recess, and then we will have open debate, as well as comments from our jury. And I want to thank the over 800 members of our jury. Normally, the limit is 12. There's no limit on Critics Court. Father Dave, you have the floor.
Thank you, Your Honor. I would like to remind the jury of the actual count against Lucasfilm and Disney. And that is they begin to negligently handle and manage the franchise. And some of the reasons pointed to by the actual charge are hiring hack activist writers, the de-canonization of the EU, and the plagiarization of old plot points, causing the franchise to never attain the box office potential it could have had. Now, as the prosecution pointed out, Episode 7 had a box office of $2 billion. That's not mismanagement, and that's not negligence from a business point of view. And in terms of the decanonization of the EU, you just made the argument that the creator has the ability to determine what is and what isn't canon. But regardless, this may be unpopular because I know there's a lot of people out there who like the EU. I'm not one of them. I was actually quite pleased that Disney made the business decision to clear up the canonical gray area that was the EU, because there are a lot of stories there that George had put his stamp of approval on, but he reserved the right, as he did with that book that came out after Star Wars, to change his mind. And so therefore, while technically canonical, they were also technically not canonical if George had to say so. So in order to free up any confusion, because there's a lot of Star Wars books, Disney made the business decision to say, okay, we're not going to consider the EU canonical just so that we can move forward in a way that will get people a new Star Wars movie as fast as possible. And so that was a business decision that was made. It didn't prevent them from going back and using stuff from the EU. It just cleared the way to make the picture clear. This is not canonical. Disney Star Wars is going to do something new and hopefully fun. And as far as plagiarizing old plot points, I made the case in episode 2 that the format of storytelling that George started with Star Wars and continued with the prequels, there are certain plot points, certain leitmotifs that happen in generational stories. And he had those same plot points in the prequels as he did with the original trilogy. The fact that J.J. Abrams chose to do something similar with his movie that made $2 billion is, again, not negligence. It's not mismanagement. And while many of us may be disappointed with what Disney has ultimately done with Star Wars, we may not like the finished product. We may not be happy with the way that this trilogy ended up. It's you still haven't really shown that this is negligence. You really haven't shown that this is mismanagement. This trilogy made a lot of money. Yes, some of us don't particularly care for it, but mismanagement and negligence are not things I think you can accuse Disney of. I rest.
Mr. Connors.
All right. Mr. Willie, can I call you that, or should I call you that?
Yes. Fine.
Mr. Willie, compared the loose plan to the Marvel Universe, and Thanos' role in the Marvel Universe, which I'm not so sure is a fair comparable assessment to an entire franchise to one storyline, because I'm curious as to why you think we should draw that comparison here, and at the end of the day, why is that relevant, I guess, is my best question.
I would argue the relevance. Oh, well, okay. Let me tackle the first part of your question. Is why I decided to use that part of my argument. Is the fact is that Marvel itself has been considered this generation's version of Star Wars, and even then, with their established characters, there was still a level of letting the filmmakers create and play in the sandbox of Marvel, and even alter characters. For example, like Thanos, like in his comic iteration, his motivation is far different than the one that was portrayed in Infinity War. My point is that even though Feige claims to have everything organized out, there is still, it's loosely organized. According to Whedon, it was loosely organized out, and there was an allowance of leeway for the filmmakers to create. The reason I compare that with the sequel trilogy is that, look, let's say, for example, of what Mr. Montgomery pointed out, that KK told Rian Johnson to make his own film. He was allowed to do. She gave him the leeway to allow him to create his own film. Now, is the fact that it's a divisive film, that's a different debate than the fact that's different from malfeasance on Disney Lucasfilm's aspect.
Okay. I guess I'm failing to see your point here. Maybe I should ask you this a different way. On the whole point of your comparison to, George not having a plan for the original trilogy, leading into the prequel trilogy, which you kind of try to connect with that, and bringing up books and other media. I got to ask you, do you like listening to the radio in your car?
Yes.
Now, you do know that the first cars that were invented didn't have radio, right?
Yes.
And those came along later in different, what would you consider like drafts of a vehicle, right? And every day or every year we get new drafts of these vehicles, and some things work, some things don't work. And over time, they excise the things that don't work, and we keep the things that work, and that's how we got to modern vehicles, right?
Correct.
So yeah, and in that, they built on those things that were pre-established. And of course, like I said, that original vehicle didn't have a radio. I'm sure it didn't have air conditioning or windshield wipers as well.
Neither seatbelts.
Exactly, but eventually they did. And at this point now, I guess my question to you is, why do you think that the inventor of the car should be brought up or responsible for anything that the individual who created the windshield wiper would do? Like if a windshield wiper were to kill somebody, why would the inventor of the car be responsible for that? Wouldn't you think that the manufacturer of the windshield wiper would be instead?
Well, what I would argue with that is that while Mr. Ford invented the car, after a while, his invention, his creation, was allowed to permutate, and so we got different types of vehicles, like motorcycles, like seat belts in cars, radios, etc. So my point is the fact is that it's Disney is the creator of the sequel trilogy. They are now the owners of Star Wars. It's no longer George Lucas. Just like how after the patent ran out for the car was no longer owned by Henry Ford. So
okay, I guess here's the thing though is once the windshield wiper worked, they didn't really change it too much over time, right? They kept it the same. They moved on to other things, right? So I guess I'm just failing to see why the inventor of the car, or in this case, the inventor of the franchise, George Lucas, seems to be the defense wants to put him on trial when it's his creation that was killed. So I guess I'm failing to understand where the argument is coming in here in a lot of your basis for your argument. Sorry about that, but
No.
I'll turn it over to Shane at that point. Thank you.
No, you're fine. I would argue is the fact that the sequel, that Star Wars is not dead, per se. And also I would argue is the fact is that it is, why should we hold Disney to a different standard than we would for George Lucas, who also was working on that sequel trilogy.
Willie, if you don't mind, I think the analogy to the car needs to be expanded, because the car is something that the end user can actually manipulate and use the way they want to use it. And this is akin to the idea of a fandom. The movie franchise has no life unless it has a fandom. And the car has no life, has no commercial value unless there's an end user, and that end user is willing to do things with the car. And so at the end of the day, the fact that we're even having this trial, at the end of the day, that there are fact that the people like myself who are not particularly happy with the products that Disney has produced over the last 10, 15 years, are willing to sit here and have this discussion in hopes that we get a better Star Wars, is proof positive that Star Wars isn't dead. And again, the whole automobile thing really kind of fails as an analogy, again, because the end user there's all kinds of people that are not car manufacturers that actually do stuff for cars. I have windshield wipers, for example, that have been improved upon since the first windshield wiper, specifically to be able to wipe away water in a much more efficient way. And that particular company has nothing to do with the company that produced my car. So it's not a really good analogy to use.
Well, let's use your analogy, Father, if I can, and thank you for that's. I love that you say you want Star Wars to be alive. We all do. We want it to continue, and I'd like to thank my esteemed colleague, Mr. Connors. I would like to quickly refute some of your evidence that you came with, Father, when you talked about the box office results being. I would counter that the box office is an indication of of the mismanagement of the franchise. When you consider that the domestic box office for episode 7 was $936 million, and then when episode 8 came, it dropped by a third. And then when episode 9 came, it dropped by, I would say 40% from the first movie. The continued dropping of the box office was an indication that fans also felt that Star Wars had mishandled the Disney franchise. And Your Honor, I leave it with that.